A listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, the Jeffrey Epstein Files have already brought down a prince. Now, after more bombshell files were released this week, a British Prime Minister could also be forced to resign. We unpack this week's developments and the growing list of powerful connections and extraordinary influence the convicted sex offender had across the world. But first, let's check the headlines this Friday, the 6th of February. The grandparents of missing South Australian toddler Gus Lamont have issued a statement rejecting claims they are not cooperating with police. They also added they are absolutely devastated after SA Police yesterday declared Gus's disappearance as a major crime. Police also announced a suspect in the case who are not Gus's parents, and they do not believe the 4-year-old is still alive. One of Australia's most infamous underworld figures, Tony Mokbel, is now a free citizen after his final drugs charges were dropped. Prosecutors have abandoned the drug trafficking case, meaning that there will be no retrial. Outside court, Mr Mokbel paid tribute to his legal team and long-term supporters, saying he's looking forward to being a free man.
It feels really nice and life goes on now.
And what does that life look like, Tony?
I'm not really sure at the moment, but it feels great.
And there will be 3,000 New South Wales police officers deployed for Israeli President Isaac Herzog's 4-day visit to Sydney next week. They've also warned pro-Palestinian protesters they could face arrest if they breach restrictions during planned demonstrations at Sydney's Town Hall. It comes as the New South Wales Police Commissioner extended restrictions on public assemblies, a move heavily criticised by civil libertarian advocates. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the latest on the Jeffrey Epstein Files. Hundreds of new documents, photos and videos were released by the Department of Justice in the US over the weekend. King Charles and Queen Camilla this week have been heckled in public after more damning allegations involving the royal's brother, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. But now pressure is mounting on the UK government and the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, while it seems for now the focus has moved away from US President Donald Trump. Joining us to unpack this week's extraordinary developments is Foreign Editor with 7 News, Hugh Whitfeld. Hugh, thanks for joining us. We know hundreds, if not thousands, of new files and documents and photos were released this week. But it's important to note, although if you are named in these files, it doesn't necessarily mean you are accused of any wrongdoing, especially when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, that's right. I think obviously Jeffrey Epstein had a broad network and there were clearly a lot of people who got caught up in that network, possibly inadvertently, or whether he was reaching out to people who maybe didn't want to get reached out to, but they end up being in particularly these troves of emails, his extensive communications. He was clearly a avid emailer, his favourite form of communication, it would seem. And so if you happen to receive even an unsolicited email from Jeffrey Epstein, then unfortunately your name may very well appear.
Now, we know there's been a lot of focus on the US President Donald Trump and his alleged connections with Jeffrey Epstein. We know about the royal family, which we'll get to in just a moment. But a massive development this week has been the real possibility that Keir Starmer, who is the British Prime Minister, is in real trouble over his appointment of an ambassador, Lord Mandelson. Explain this development for us.
Yeah, so Keir Starmer has been on shaky ground politically basically ever since he came into the Prime Ministership in the English summer of 2024. But this particular scandal and crisis for the British Prime Minister is probably the most existential that he's faced, because now his own Labor MPs, and the number is growing, we're told, by the hour, are calling for him to take action, and that action may include stepping aside. Peter Mandelson is a name who has been tied up in the Labor side of British politics for nearly 4 decades. A machinist, a political machinist, Machiavellian political operator who has worked both in the shadows and at the forefront of British politics, stretching right back to the leadership of Neil Kinnock in the late 1980s, early 1990s, becoming an MP himself in 1992 and being one of the architects, alongside people like Alistair Campbell, of the new Labor victory that propelled Tony Blair into the Prime Ministership in 1997. What followed, though, as an MP, was a series of 2 at least high-profile scandals that ultimately caused him to lose his job twice. He was forced out of the cabinet under Tony Blair, then managed to engineer himself into a job as an ambassador of a sort to the European Commission in Brussels, came back to Parliament as a Lord in the House of Lords. He was parachuted in. Again, that allowed him to be a cabinet minister, quite senior, First Secretary of State. Again caught up in scandal, pushed to the shadows, brought back again by Keir Starmer to help drive his election campaign in 2024, and then given this plum posting as the US ambassador, or the British ambassador to the US, in December 2024. Starmer has known Mandelson for a long time because of that connection to Labor Party politics and the Labor machine in the UK. Where it has fallen apart for Starmer is clearly a blind spot in trusting, it would seem, Mandelson, and refusing to act or believe or even read, potentially, the multiple reports about the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Mandelson, stretching back many, many years. Now, in the Epstein Files that have been released over the last couple of weeks, there are photos and communications showing this quite close, it would seem, relationship between Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein. Now, the vetting process that Keir Starmer's Downing Street operation went through was clearly flawed, because in 2003, the Financial Times newspaper in the UK published those links. It made the link between Epstein and Mandelson, that Mandelson had returned to Epstein's home and stayed with him after Epstein was convicted as a pedophile the first time round back in 2009. So Mandelson knew he was a convicted pedophile, and yet he continued the relationship. Starmer should have known. He goes to Mandelson and says, "Did you have a close relationship with Jeffrey Epstein?" And Mandelson says, "No." And apparently that was enough for Keir Starmer to appoint Peter Mandelson to this plum job, one of the most important ambassadorships that a British government can appoint anyone to in Washington, that key link between London and DC, the special relationship that exists between the US and the UK. Following on from that, in these Epstein files, it's now emerged that Peter Mandelson is accused of leaking valuable government information about what was taking place in Downing Street when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister and dealing with the financial crisis, gave that information to Jeffrey Epstein, which is mind-blowing. Now, if Downing Street knew about that, which they may have, the security services may very well have known about that, MI5 and MI6. We're waiting to see what they did tell Downing Street in that security review. But if Keir Starmer knew that, then it's looking more and more likely that Starmer can't survive. And as I say, he was already on very shaky ground politically.
It is mind-blowing, the fact that now Keir Starmer has come out. He's even been quoted as saying that he was unaware of the depth and darkness of Lord Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Does this yet again show the enormity and the power that this convicted sex offender had, not only on the horrific trafficking of all of these underage girls and boys, but his political influence on an incredibly high level?
Yeah, his network clearly was enormous. And, I guess there would be people who would be quite envious of his ability to mix with some of the most influential people in a number of countries and clearly wield extraordinary power. And for Keir Starmer, who on Wednesday in Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons was forced to say sorry, apologising to the victims of Jeffrey Epstein for allowing Peter Mandelson to get a government job again. It clearly didn't work because then, as you say, he said none of us knew the depths and darkness of that relationship at a speech in the UK on Thursday, their time, overnight our time. So he's having to say sorry now every day because his apology each day is not good enough. We now have Labor MPs, as I say, who are openly despairing about what to do. There are those who say it is an unforgivable portrayal to the victims of Jeffrey Epstein's victims, particularly when they have tried to frame themselves as a government as one that supports victims of whether it be domestic violence or sexual abuse and horrific violence against women. There are those who fear for their own jobs when an election comes around next time, and they don't like the influence of people like Morgan McSweeney, who is Keir Starmer's chief of staff, who's been close to that Labor machine that Peter Mandelson's been a part of for many decades, having huge influence clearly over Keir Starmer.
Okay, let's talk about the royal family and then we'll get on to the US President Donald Trump. We know there were more very damaging photos of the person formerly known as Prince Andrew that were dropped in more Epstein Files over the weekend. We know that he's been stripped of all royal titles. One may argue the royal family knew many months ago there were worse things to come regarding his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. We saw King Charles and Queen Camilla again getting heckled in public this week. How does this again play out for the royal family?
I think you've got to give some credit to the palace in that towards the end of last year, when they eventually stripped Prince Andrew of his everything, princely titles and everything, they tried to get ahead of the game. They really did, it would seem. But it's catching up on them really fast now. And in fact, it's probably caught them because now you've got a situation where members of the royal family cannot go anywhere without being confronted by this issue. Prince Edward asked about it at a forum where he probably thought he was safe from questions from a moderator on a panel at an event. The Queen being thrown questions by journalists who are part of the royal press pack. When the royal press pack kind of breaks the rules, they're in trouble because they can't keep those questions contained. Part of the agreement that those press pack journalists go into when they get accreditation to go into those press pens is that they don't do things like that. And now they're basically revolting. They're doing it anyway. So it makes it very uncomfortable for the King and the Queen and the Prince of Wales when he goes to Saudi Arabia next week. I mean, media there is very controlled, but at the same time, it's very easy for someone to ask a very awkward question at a Republican event when the cameras are rolling. So I think the damage is hurting. And when you've got institutions like the palace and the parliament under siege in the way that they are, it's very hard for people to trust those institutions. It's very hard for people to trust the establishment, as they call it in the UK, and it really feeds into the Nigel Farage and the reforms of the world to say they're not on your side, I'm on your side, and you see this huge jump in support for people like Nigel Farage and Reform and Republic groups as well.
So, Hugh, let's move to the US now. How do you think the US President Donald Trump is faring with these more damning allegations and files being dropped regarding Jeffrey Epstein?
Donald Trump's been on a real political journey because for a lot of years he was a Democrat and he was very good friends with the Clintons. We know he was part of that world. We have the pictures. And he can't really say, I didn't really know him very well, we weren't pally. I mean, they're backslapping each other, Trump and Epstein. There are questions about how much he can actually trust the Department of Justice in terms of what they're releasing, what they're redacting, and what they still have that will never be released because they're in the grip of a Trump administration that clearly doesn't believe in the independence of be it the Federal Reserve or the Department of Justice. It's a big challenge for those of us, whether you're a journalist or a punter on the street, who want the right to know what is going on. Donald Trump this week gave an interview to NBC News where he was asked about Bill Clinton as a former president, and he said, well, Bill's always been very good to me. I like Bill. And it's almost paving the way for Bill not to do the dirty on him when he eventually appears before that hearing and gives testimony. We know that Bill Clinton has a blind spot in terms of his sexual proclivities and what he does behind closed doors. The Monica Lewinsky scandal almost brought down his presidency, but he survived. And whatever Donald Trump runs the White House the way he does, which is basically take no prisoners, I don't care what you say, I'm going to put my name on the Kennedy Center, he will likely survive until the end of his term and, who knows, potentially longer.
Hugh, certainly a lot more to play out. Thanks so much for joining us.
Cheers, Tash.
And an important note, there is no suggestion Bill Clinton, Peter Mandelson, nor Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor committed any sexual offences. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. See you next time.